The stranger's hands were still wrapped in soiled rags when Doc Patterson rode up to the Brennan property that cold March morning, and the first thing Doc noticed, the very first thing that made him pull his horse to a stop, was the way the man carried those chickens into the root cellar like they were the most precious things in all of Wyoming territory. 4 fingers showed dark through the cloth on the left hand, 3 on the right. Doc counted them silently, the way he had counted so many damaged fingers in his 32 years of practicing frontier medicine, and he felt that familiar weight settle into his chest. The weight that came with knowing a man might lose something he could never get back. "You the doctor?" the stranger called out, not stopping his work, not even looking up. "I am," Doc said, dismounting slowly. "Name's Patterson. I heard there was a woman here who needed looking after." "She does." The stranger finally met his eyes, and Doc saw something there, something more than exhaustion, more than the pain that must have been throbbing through those damaged hands. It was the look of a man who had made a choice and was still living inside of it. "She's in the shelter. I'll take you to her." The root cellar had been converted into living quarters, 8 feet deep, 12 feet wide, with burlap sacking nailed over the earthen walls for insulation. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner, its pipe rising through a crude hole in the wooden ceiling. The space smelled of wood smoke and healing salves and something else, something Doc couldn't quite name, the particular scent of 2 people surviving together in close quarters. The woman sat on a low cot, her hands wrapped in clean cotton bandages, her face gaunt but alert. She was perhaps 29 or 30, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that held the particular kind of wariness Doc had seen in women who had learned that the world could take everything from them in a single night. "Mrs. Brennan," Doc said gently, setting down his medical bag, "I'm here to examine your hands." "Clara," she corrected, her voice stronger than he expected. "Nobody's called me Mrs. Brennan in 26 months. The stranger stood in the doorway, blocking most of the light that came down the wooden steps, and Doc noticed for the first time the railroad ticket sticking out of the man's coat pocket. California bound, dated 18 days ago. The train was long gone by now, had been gone for more than 2 weeks. "You can stay," Clara said to the stranger, without looking at him, as if she had felt his hesitation, as if she knew he was considering whether to leave them alone. Doc began to unwrap the bandages carefully, and what he saw made him pause, not because it was worse than expected, but because it was so much better. 4 fingers on the left hand had been frostbitten, 3 on the right, but the tissue was pink at the edges, healthy, healing. Someone had known exactly what to do. "Frostbite doesn't forgive delay, Mrs. Clara," Doc said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Warm water, never hot, 98 degrees, no more. 20 minutes, then dry. The body heals what we don't destroy with impatience." He looked up at the stranger. "Who taught you that?" The man's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Nobody taught me," he said, his voice flat. "I learned it too late to matter." But not too late for her. Doc filed that away, the particular pain in those words, the way the man's eyes had gone distant for just a moment, and turned his attention back to Clara's hands. "How long were you exposed?" 4 hours, Clara said. "Maybe more. I don't remember all of it." "And he found you?" "He found me." Doc glanced toward the doorway again, but the stranger was already gone. Back outside, back to whatever work he was doing to keep this broken homestead functioning. Through the wooden ceiling, Doc could hear footsteps, the sound of something being dragged across frozen ground. "That ticket in his pocket," Doc said carefully, "it says California." Clara's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a flicker of something that might have been fear, might have been hope, might have been both tangled together in ways she couldn't separate. "He had a job waiting," she said. "Railroad surveyor, $3.50 a day. And he's still here. He's still here." Doc finished his examination in silence, noting the remarkable healing, the careful way the skin was knitting back together. Whoever this stranger was, he had done everything right: the water temperature, the timing, the gentle handling of tissue that could have been destroyed by panic or ignorance. "I'll come back in a week," Doc said finally. "But I think you're going to keep those fingers." Clara looked down at her bandaged hands, hands that had nearly been taken from her, hands that this stranger had spent 18 days carefully saving. "He hasn't left," she said softly, almost to herself. "Not once, not even to go into town for supplies. He sends word through the mail rider, pays twice what things cost to have them delivered. He won't leave me alone." "Why not?" "I don't know." She finally looked up, and Doc saw the question burning in her eyes, the question she was too afraid to ask out loud, too afraid to have answered. "I don't know why anyone would stay." Doc Patterson had been practicing medicine in Wyoming Territory for 32 years, and in that time he had learned that every wound told a story, if you knew how to read it. He rode away from the Brennan property that morning with more questions than answers, but one thing was already clear. Whatever had happened between that stranger and that widow during the blizzard 3 weeks ago, it had changed something in both of them. The way they moved around each other, careful, aware, like two people learning a new language together, spoke of intimacy born from crisis. He was halfway to the main road when Mrs. Prudence Whitley intercepted him, her horse pulling up alongside his with the particular urgency of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. "Dr. Patterson," she said, her voice carrying the sharp edge of concern that always preceded gossip, "I see you've been to the Brennan place." "I have." "And did you see him? The stranger?" "I did." Mrs. Whitley was 52 years old, the town postmistress, the keeper of every letter and secret that passed through this corner of the territory. Her husband had left her for another woman 7 years ago, and since then she had appointed herself the guardian of public morality, particularly where matters between unmarried men and women were concerned. "A stranger staying with a widow," she said, her mouth forming around the words like they tasted bitter. "That's not charity, Dr. Patterson. That's scandal waiting to bloom." Doc thought about the way the stranger had looked at Clara, not with desire, not with expectation, but with something that looked almost like devotion. He thought about the California ticket in the man's pocket, the job he had given up, the future he had abandoned. "Maybe," Doc said carefully, "or maybe it's just a man who didn't want to let a woman die alone in the snow." "That's what they all say at first," Mrs. Whitley replied. "But mark my words, he'll want something for his trouble. They always do." She rode away before Doc could respond, and he sat there on his horse for a long moment, watching the smoke rise from the Brennan root cellar, thinking about the particular kind of courage it took to stay when leaving was so much easier. The story came out in pieces over the following weeks, not from Clara, who kept her own counsel, but from the stranger himself, whose name turned out to be Eli Harding, a man of 34 years who had been walking toward California when the worst blizzard in 40 years changed everything. Doc pieced it together from his weekly visits, from the things Eli said and the things he didn't say, from the way Clara's hands healed and the way something else between them seemed to be healing too. The storm had come without proper warning, or rather, with warnings that Clara couldn't afford to heed. A passing rider had told her 3 days before that something big was building in the mountains, that the old-timers were calling it the worst in 4 decades, that anyone with sense would move their livestock to the shelters in town. But the shelters in town cost $2 per animal per night, and Clara had 6 animals and only $6 to her name. Her husband had died of typhoid fever 26 months earlier, leaving her with 160 acres of marginal land, a cabin that was slowly falling apart, and a choice between poverty and survival that most days looked like the same thing. So she had stayed, had tried to secure the livestock herself, had been working outside when the temperature dropped 42 degrees in 4 hours, when the wind hit 60 miles an hour, when the snow began falling at 3 inches every hour and didn't stop. The west wall of her cabin, weakened by termites she couldn't afford to treat, had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and Clara had been pinned beneath the debris, her hands exposed to the killing cold, her body slowly shutting down while the world turned white around her. She'd been trapped for 4 hours before she lost consciousness. Her livestock had frozen where they stood, 4 cows worth $30 each, 2 horses worth $40 each, dead in the field like monuments to everything she had worked to build. And somewhere in that white silence, Ellie Harding had heard something. He never could explain what it was. Not a scream, not a cry for help, just a sound that shouldn't have existed in that frozen emptiness. He had been walking toward Cheyenne, 12 miles away, where a train would leave in 72 hours to take him to California and a surveyor's job that paid $3.50 a day. He had been thinking about the new life waiting for him, about starting over, about leaving behind everything that had hurt him. But he had heard that sound, and he had followed it. When he found Clara, she was half buried in snow and debris, her hands black with cold, her pulse barely 40 beats per minute. He later told Doc that he knew, in that moment, that she had maybe 2 hours left, that if he kept walking toward Cheyenne, he would make his train and she would die, and no one would ever know he had been there. The choice should have been harder than it was. He wrapped her hands in his own shirt, the warmth from his body the only heat available in that frozen landscape. He carried her to the root cellar, the only structure still standing on her property, and he built a fire with wood he scavenged from the collapsed cabin. He saved what animals he could, 4 chickens out of 23, and he fortified the shelter against the wind that was still howling outside. And when the storm passed, when the roads began to clear, when the stagecoach started running again 3 times a week, he didn't leave. He sent word to California through the mail rider, paying premium prices to have a message delivered. The surveyor's job was given to someone else. The new life he had planned disappeared like smoke in the winter wind. And still he stayed. Why? Doc asked him once, during one of those weekly visits when Clara was sleeping and the 2 men sat outside the root cellar, watching the spring thaw slowly transform the frozen landscape. Ellie was quiet for a long moment, his damaged hands, still wrapped, still healing, resting on his knees. "My mother died while I was 400 miles away," he said finally, his voice carrying that particular heaviness of old grief. "I was chasing railroad work, trying to build something for myself. I got the telegram 6 days after she passed." He looked down at his hands. "I learned medicine after that. Proper care. How to treat frostbite, how to treat fever, how to treat all the things I couldn't treat when it mattered. Too late for her. Too late for her. But not too late for—" He stopped, looked toward the root cellar where Clara was sleeping. Not too late. Doc understood then. The stranger wasn't staying because he expected something from Clara. He was staying because leaving would have meant his mother died for nothing, would have meant he learned all those medical skills just to walk away from someone who needed them. Some debts, Doc realized, could only be paid forward. By the time April arrived, Clara's hands had healed enough that she could hold a tin cup by herself, a small victory that Doc would never forget because of the look on Eli's face when she lifted it. Pure joy, unguarded, like a man watching a miracle unfold. 14 days, Doc noted, making a mark in his medical journal. From complete inability to grip to holding a full cup. That's remarkable healing. He soaks them twice a day, Clara said, flexing her fingers experimentally. 98 degrees exactly. He uses your thermometer to check. My thermometer? The one you left last week. He said he wanted to be certain. Doc looked at Eli, who was standing in his usual spot near the doorway, watching Clara's movements with an intensity that bordered on devotion. The body reclaims what the cold tried to take, Eli said quietly, but only if you give it the right conditions. Patience and precision, that's what saves tissue. Where did you learn that? Really? Ellie's jaw tightened. a doctor in Nebraska, after my mother died. I paid him $5 to teach me everything he knew about treating fever and frostbite and pneumonia. Everything I should have known before. Clara set down the cup carefully, her eyes moving to Eli's face, and Doc saw something pass between them, a recognition, an understanding. Two wounded people who had finally found someone who understood what it meant to carry guilt that wasn't quite their own. "He brushes my hair," Claire said suddenly, her voice soft. "Every morning, because I couldn't lift my arms at first, and then because..." She stopped, color rising to her cheeks. "Because we got used to it." The intimacy in that simple statement was more revealing than anything else Doc had witnessed between them. Hair brushing was not a medical necessity. It was something else entirely, the kind of tender care that crossed the line between patient and caretaker into something deeper. But before Doc could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them, and Mrs. Whitley's voice carried down into the root cellar like a cold wind. "Dr. Patterson, are you down there? I need to speak with you immediately." Doc climbed the wooden steps to find Mrs. Whitley waiting with two other townswomen, Mrs. Crawford, who ran the boarding house, and Mrs. Jensen, whose husband had lost his hand to improper frostbite treatment 3 winters ago. "This has gone on long enough," Mrs. Whitley said, her voice pitched to Carrie. 6 weeks, Dr. Patterson. That man has been living with her for 6 weeks. He saved her life. And now he's ruining it." Mrs. Whitley crossed her arms. "Do you know what they're saying in town? Do you know what people think when they see her at the general store, when they see him carrying supplies on her behalf? They think she's a woman of loose morals. They think he's taking advantage of her desperation. And they're not wrong to think it, because what other explanation is there? A stranger doesn't stay with a widow for 6 weeks without expecting something in return." Doc thought about the California ticket, the surveyor's job, the $3.50 a day that Eli had given up. He thought about the way Eli looked at Clara, not with desire, but with something that looked almost like reverence. "Maybe he stays because he sees something worth staying for," Doc said quietly. Mrs. Whitley's laugh was sharp and short. "He's playing savior. Watch, he'll be gone the moment the roads clear properly. They always are." She rode away with her companions, leaving Doc standing outside the root cellar, wondering how many good things had been destroyed by people who couldn't imagine goodness was possible. The spring thaw brought new problems, mud that made travel difficult, snowmelt that flooded the lower pastures, the particular kind of hope that came with warmer weather and longer days. It also brought the question that had been hanging unspoken between Eli and Clara since the moment the blizzard passed. Would he stay? Doc returned for his weekly visit to find them in the middle of what was clearly their established routine, Eli heating water on the cast-iron stove, Clara sitting with her hands extended, both of them moving with the easy familiarity of people who had spent weeks in close quarters. 4 fingers showing black, but only the tips, Eli was explaining, showing Doc the precise technique he used. Maybe ½ an inch of damage on each one. But see here, the pink returning at the edges? That's healthy tissue reclaiming territory. He demonstrated the soaking process, 98 degrees exactly, 20 minutes. Gentle patting dry with clean cotton, and Doc found himself taking mental notes, impressed by the man's thoroughness. "Jensen," Doc said suddenly, remembering Mrs. Jensen's presence at Mrs. Whitley's confrontation. "You know what happened to Mr. Jensen 3 winters ago?" Eli paused his work. "I heard something about it. Lost his hand. Lost it to his own panic. Frostbitten fingers, just like Clara's. But he used hot water, 140 degrees, maybe more. Cooked the tissue he was trying to save. Destroyed every finger trying to preserve them." "That's the difference," Eli said quietly, resuming his careful work on Clara's hands. "Between panic and patience. Between fear and knowledge. He didn't know what he was doing, so he did the wrong thing faster. He looked up at Clara, something soft in his eyes. I knew what I was doing. I just didn't know why I was doing it until I found her. Clara's breath caught, a small sound that Doc almost missed. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I learned medicine after my mother died," Eli said. "Paid good money to learn it. But I never used it, not once in 4 years of traveling. Never found anyone who needed what I knew." He set down the cloth he had been using to dry her fingers. "And then the blizzard came. And there you were. And everything I learned, everything I thought I learned too late, suddenly mattered." The silence that followed was filled with something Doc couldn't quite name, the sound of two people recognizing themselves in each other, the sound of wounds that might finally be healing. "I thought I brought bad luck to anyone who stayed close," Clara said finally, her voice cracking. "My husband died. My parents died. Everyone I loved died or left. I left my mother alone when she needed me most," Eli replied. "Chased work instead of staying. I've been running from that guilt for 4 years. And now I'm not running anymore." Doc stood quietly in the corner of the root cellar, watching this exchange unfold, feeling like an intruder on something sacred. These two people, broken in different ways, carrying different wounds, had somehow found in each other the healing they couldn't find alone. But the town wouldn't see it that way. The town would see a scandal, a violation of propriety, a widow and a stranger living together without the blessing of marriage or the protection of family. And sooner or later that judgment would catch up with them. The confrontation came sooner than Doc expected. He was at the general store 2 weeks later, purchasing supplies for his medical practice, when he heard the commotion outside, voices raised, Mrs. Whitley's distinctive tone cutting through the murmur of daily commerce. By the time he reached the door, a small crowd had gathered around Eli, who stood with a basket of supplies on one arm, his face carefully blank. "I'm asking you a simple question," Mrs. Whitley was saying, her voice pitched for maximum audience impact. "What's your angle, Mr. Harding? What do you really want from that woman?" "I want her to be well," Eli replied quietly. "Oh, I'm sure you do. Well enough to work? Well enough to sign over her land? Well enough that she doesn't need me." Eli's voice remained steady, but Doc could see the tension in his jaw, the way his damaged hands had curled into loose fists. "That's what I want. For her to be whole again. And then what? You'll just ride away, back to California?" Eli was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally. "That's her choice, not mine." The admission seemed to catch Mrs. Whitley off guard. She had been expecting defensiveness, perhaps, or anger, not this quiet resignation to a future he couldn't control. "A widow's land is worth something in this territory," she pressed. 160 acres. Maybe $400 to the right buyer. Is that what you're after? I gave up a job that paid $3.50 a day to stay with her," Eli said, his voice finally hardening. "I've been here 8 weeks. That's $196 I could have earned in California. The land isn't worth what I've already given up." He picked up his basket and walked away, leaving Mrs. Whitley and her audience in stunned silence. Doc followed him. "That woman won't let this go," he said, falling into step beside Eli. "She's convinced you're after something. Everyone's after something. What are you after?" Eli stopped walking. They were outside the Mercantile now, away from the crowd, but his voice dropped anyway, became something private, something meant only for Doc's ears. "I'm after the feeling that I did something right for once, that I stayed when it mattered, that all those years of guilt and all that money I spent learning medicine and all the miles I traveled running away from what I couldn't face, that it all added up to something. And Clara is." Eli's voice caught. "Clara is the first person in 4 years who made me want to stop running. Not because she needed me, she doesn't, not anymore, though because, when I look at her, I see someone who understands what it's like to believe you've broken everything you touched. Doc thought about his own wife, Eleanor, who had died in childbirth 23 years ago. He thought about all the nights he had spent wondering if he could have done something different, if his skills had been inadequate, if his presence had somehow contributed to her death. "Do you love her?" he asked quietly. Ely's laugh was short and soft. "I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore. But I know that when she holds a cup by herself, I feel like the whole world is right. I know that when she smiles, which isn't often, I forget for a moment that I was ever the kind of man who left his mother to die alone." He looked toward the road that led to Clara's property. "Is that love? I don't know. But it's the closest thing I felt to hope in 4 years." The situation deteriorated as spring advanced into early summer. Clara's hands continued to heal, 7 fingers saved, full function returning, the kind of medical success that would have been celebrated if it hadn't come wrapped in scandal. She could button her own dress now, brush her own hair, grip tools well enough to begin rebuilding her homestead. But the rebuilding came with consequences. When she walked into town, the other women fell silent. When she attended church, an empty circle formed around her pew. When she needed supplies, Mr. Harrison at the general store served her last, always last, making her wait while other customers came and went. And through it all, Eli stayed. He built a lean-to addition to the root cellar, giving Clara more space. He repaired the fences that had been damaged in the blizzard. He purchased 2 new dairy cows, $30 each, and 12 new chickens to replace what had been lost. He did the work of rebuilding her life without once being asked, without once expecting anything in return. And the town watched, and the town talked. "You're making things worse for her," Doc said one afternoon, finding Eli repairing a fence post on Clara's property. "The longer you stay, the harder it gets." "I know." "Then why don't you leave? You could go to California. Get that surveyor job. Start over." Eli drove the post into the ground with 3 hard swings of the hammer, then straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with his damaged hands. "When I found her in that snow," he said slowly, "she was dying. Her pulse was maybe 40 beats a minute. Her hands were black. She had 2 hours left, maybe less. He set down the hammer. And I thought about keeping walking. I thought about Cheyenne, about the train, about California. I thought about how easy it would be to pretend I never heard her. But you didn't keep walking." "No. And now," his voice cracked slightly, "now I can't stop seeing what would have happened if I had. She would have died alone in the snow, and no one would have known for days. They would have found her body in the spring thaw, maybe." Her hands frozen solid, her face frozen solid. Just another widow who couldn't survive the winter. Doc was quiet for a long moment, feeling the weight of that image, the particular horror of loneliness at the moment of death. "So you stay because you couldn't bear to see her die alone. I stay because leaving would mean she almost died for nothing. I stay because every day I'm here, she gets a little stronger, a little more whole. And maybe," he picked up the hammer again, "maybe when she doesn't need me anymore, she'll still want me here. And maybe that will be enough." The breaking point came on a warm evening in late May, when Clara told Eli to leave. Doc heard about it the next morning from Mrs. Crawford at the boarding house, where Eli had appeared the night before with a small bag of belongings and the particular expression of a man whose world had just collapsed. "She pushed him out," Mrs. Crawford reported, her voice carrying equal parts satisfaction and curiosity. "Said she wouldn't be the reason he lost everything. Said he should go to California, live his life, stop sacrificing himself for a woman who wasn't worth it." Doc found Eli at the boarding house that afternoon, sitting on the narrow bed in the small room Mrs. Crawford rented for $1.50 a week. "She's afraid," Doc said without preamble. "I know. Afraid you'll leave on your own terms. So she pushed you away on hers?" "I know. So what are you going to do about it?" Ellie reached into his pocket and pulled out a railroad ticket. Fresh, recently purchased, California bound. "The train leaves tomorrow at 6 in the morning," he said flatly. "The surveyor job is still available. They need workers. There's a shortage in California, always has been." Doc sat down on the only chair in the small room, feeling suddenly very old. "When Eleanor died," he said quietly, "I wanted to leave too. Just pack up my medical bag and ride until I found somewhere that didn't remind me of her. But I stayed, because leaving would have meant she died in a place where no one remembered her. That's different." "Is it?" Doc leaned forward. "You told me you stayed because leaving would mean Clara almost died for nothing. Because every day you're here, she gets stronger. Because maybe, when she doesn't need you anymore, she'll still want you here." He paused. "Has any of that changed?" Ely was silent for a long moment, staring at the railroad ticket in his hands. "She told me to go. She told you to go because she's terrified you'll leave. There's a difference." "What difference?" "The difference between pushing someone away because you don't want them and pushing someone away because you're afraid of what it will mean if they stay." Doc stood, moved toward the door. "I've seen a lot of wounds in 32 years of practicing medicine, Eli. Physical wounds, emotional wounds, the kind of wounds that never fully heal. And I've learned that the worst ones, the ones that leave the deepest scars, are the ones we inflict on ourselves because we're too afraid to let someone help us." He paused at the door. "Clara Brennan is terrified that everyone she loves will die or leave, so she pushed you away before you could leave on your own. The question is, are you going to prove her right? The train left at 6 in the morning." Ellie wasn't on it. Instead, he walked to the blacksmith shop, where a job offer had been sitting on the table for 3 weeks. $2.75 a day. Permanent work. The kind of stability that could build a life. He turned it down. "I'm not staying for a job," he told Mr. Morrison, the blacksmith. "I'm staying for something else." Then he walked to Clara's property. She was standing outside the root cellar when he arrived, her arms crossed over her chest, her face a careful mask that couldn't quite hide the redness around her eyes. "I told you to go," she said, her voice rough. "I know. The train left this morning. You should have been on it." "I know." "Then why are you here?" Ellie stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to see the way her hands, those hands he had spent weeks saving, were trembling slightly. "Because you told me to go," he said simply. "And I realized that was the first thing you've asked of me in 10 weeks. Every other time you've just accepted what I offered without asking for anything. I didn't want to ask for anything. I know, because asking means expecting. And expecting means disappointment when people leave." Clara's careful mask cracked slightly, and Doc, watching from the road where he had stopped his horse, saw the fear that had been driving her all along. "Everyone leaves," she whispered. "Everyone I've ever loved has died or left. My parents, my husband. It's like there's something wrong with me, something that drives people away or brings bad luck, or I'm not leaving. You should. You should go to California, get that job, build the life you were planning. I'm not worth. Let me tell you what you're worth." Eli took another step closer. "You're worth missing a train. You're worth giving up a job that paid $3.50 a day. You're worth 10 weeks of soaking bandages and cooking meals and brushing hair and watching you sleep because I was afraid you'd stop breathing. That's not. You're worth every gossip in town talking about us. You're worth Mrs. Whitley confronting me in the middle of the street. You're worth Mr. Harrison making you wait at the back of every line." His voice cracked. "You're worth the first peace I've felt since I left my mother to die alone 4 years ago." Clara was crying now, tears running down her face, and she didn't seem to notice or care. "I don't know how to let someone stay," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to trust that you won't wake up one morning and realize I'm not worth the trouble. I don't know how to. Then let me teach you." Eli reached out, took her hands, those hands that had been black with cold, that had been saved through patience and precision, and the kind of care that only comes from someone who refuses to give up. Let me stay long enough to prove that staying is real. And if you still want me to leave after that, after I've shown you what I mean, then I'll go. How long? As long as it takes." He lifted her hands, pressed his lips gently to her knuckles, the knuckles that had nearly been lost, that were now warm and whole and trembling in his grasp. "I've already given up California. I've already given up the surveyor job. I've already given up the life I thought I wanted. What's a little more time?" Clara laughed, a broken, wet sound that was half sob, and Doc saw the moment when something shifted in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of trust. The first tiny crack in the wall she had built around herself. "Staying is a choice that becomes a promise," she whispered. "Someone told me that once. I didn't believe them. Believe them now." The Sunday service at the community church was always well attended. 47 souls by Doc's count gathered in the small wooden building to hear Pastor Hensley speak about grace and forgiveness and the particular challenges of frontier life. But this Sunday was different. This Sunday, everyone knew that Eli Harding had refused to leave, that he had turned down the blacksmith job, that he had been seen carrying Clara through deep spring mud when she twisted her ankle on the road to church. The congregation was buzzing with speculation when Doc arrived. Mrs. Whitley sat in her usual pew near the front, flanked by Mrs. Crawford and Mrs. Jensen, their faces wearing identical expressions of righteous anticipation. Clara and Eli sat near the back, their shoulders barely touching, their faces carefully neutral. But Doc noticed the way Clara's hand rested on the pew between them, palm up, fingers slightly curled, and the way Eli's hand rested beside it, not quite touching, but close enough that the intention was clear. Pastor Hensley opened the service with the usual prayers and hymns, then turned to the congregation with the particular expression that preceded his weekly invitation for blessings and concerns. "Is there anyone who would like to share?" he asked. Mrs. Whitley stood immediately. "I have a concern," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the small church. "About the state of morality in our community. About—" But before she could continue, Eli stood. The congregation went silent, not the polite silence of attention, but the electric silence of anticipation. Everyone turned to watch as Eli walked forward, his damaged hands visible, his face a study in quiet determination. "I came through this town by accident," he began, his voice clear and steady. "I was walking to Cheyenne in a blizzard, trying to catch a train to California, trying to build a new life somewhere that didn't remind me of everything I'd lost." He paused, looking out at the congregation, at Mrs. Whitley, frozen in her pew, at Doc, who nodded slightly, at Clara, whose face had gone pale. And then I heard a sound in the storm, a sound that shouldn't have existed, and I followed it, and I found a woman dying in the snow, a woman whose hands were black with cold, whose pulse was barely beating, who had maybe 2 hours left before the land claimed her. His voice caught slightly, and he took a moment to steady himself. I had a choice. I could keep walking, 12 miles to Cheyenne, a train in 72 hours, a job waiting in California. Or I could stay, and I stayed, not because I expected anything from her, not because I wanted her land or her gratitude or her. He stopped, shook his head. I stayed because I couldn't bear to leave someone to die alone, because I left my own mother to die alone 4 years ago, and I've been running from that guilt ever since. The congregation was utterly silent now, every face turned toward Eli, every breath held. I stayed to save her life, but somewhere along the way, somewhere between the frostbite and the thaw, I stopped wanting to leave. Not because she needed me anymore. Her hands are healed. She can take care of herself. She doesn't need me. He turned to look at Clara directly, and Doc saw something pass between them, something private and powerful and real. I stay because when I look at her, I see someone who understands what it's like to believe you've broken everything you've touched. I stay because her smile, which isn't often, but when it comes, makes me forget that I was ever the kind of man who left his mother to die alone. He walked toward Clara's pew, his eyes never leaving her face. I missed my train. I lost my job. I gave up California. And I would do it again, every day, because staying with her isn't sacrifice. It's the first thing that's felt like home since I left my mother's grave. Clara stood, tears streaming down her face, and Doc saw 26 months of grief and loneliness and fear begin to crack. I spent 2 years believing I bring bad luck to anyone who stays, she said, her voice shaking. My husband died. My parents died. Everyone I loved died or left, and I was sure that there was something wrong with me. She took Eli's hand, the hand she couldn't feel 8 weeks ago, the hand he had used to save her. But you stayed, and you're still here. Maybe, her voice broke. Maybe I was wrong. The congregation held its breath. And then, from the front of the church, Mrs. Whitley's voice cut through the silence, but it wasn't the sharp, accusatory tone Doc had expected. She stopped, cleared her throat. I owe you both an apology. Every head swiveled toward her. I was wrong, Mrs. Whitley said, her voice smaller than Doc had ever heard it. I assumed that you wanted something from her. Something she couldn't afford to give. She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. My husband left me for another woman 7 years ago. He said he stayed because he loved me, but he didn't mean it. He was just waiting for something better to come along. She looked up, and Doc saw something he had never expected to see on Prudence Whitley's face, genuine remorse. I thought you were the same kind of man. I thought you were U.S.-ener. But I was wrong. She stood, walked toward Eli and Clara, her back straight but her voice soft. Some men stay because they want something. You stayed because you saw something worth staying for. And she swallowed hard. I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner. The congregation exhaled as one, and Doc felt something shift in the room, the particular kind of shift that happens when judgment gives way to understanding. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the spring sunshine, Doc stood with Eli and Clara outside the church, watching the townspeople who had shunned them for weeks now approach with cautious smiles and tentative invitations. Mrs. Crawford offered dinner at the boarding house. Mrs. Jensen, whose husband had lost his hand to improper frostbite treatment, asked if Eli would teach her what he knew about wound care. Mr. Morrison, the blacksmith, renewed his job offer, and when Eli declined again, he offered to help with the fence repairs on Clara's property instead. This is what healing looks like, Doc said quietly, watching the community slowly knit itself back together. Not just the hands, not just the body, the whole person. Eli looked at Clara, whose face was brighter than Doc had ever seen it. She taught me that, Eli said softly. She taught me that staying is a choice that becomes a promise. And that promises, the real ones, don't break. The summer brought growth, not just in Clara's garden, which flourished with tomatoes and beans and squash, but in everything around her. The lean-to addition to the root cellar became a proper cabin, 16 feet by 20 feet, built with timber framing and a good roof and windows that let in the morning light. Ellie did most of the work himself, but men from town came to help on weekends, and Doc noticed that the number of helpers grew each week as the community's attitude shifted. The 12 chickens multiplied. The 2 new dairy cows proved fertile. The 160 acres that had seemed like a burden began to feel like a blessing. And through it all, Clara and Eli built something neither of them had expected to find. Doc visited weekly at first, then every other week, then monthly as Clara's hands completed their healing. On his final official visit, he examined her fingers carefully, all 7 that had been damaged, all 7 that had been saved, and pronounced her fully recovered. Remarkable healing, he said, making his last notes in his medical journal. "I've rarely seen frostbite this severe resolve so completely. The body heals what we don't destroy with impatience," Clara said, smiling at Eli. "Someone taught me that. Someone taught me first," Eli replied. "I just passed it along." Doc looked at the two of them, sitting close together in the new cabin, their hands occasionally touching, their faces carrying the particular glow of people who had found unexpected happiness, and felt something warm settle into his chest. "I'd like to teach you something," he said to Eli. "Proper suturing technique. You got good hands, steady, patient. This territory needs a man who knows when to stay." Eli looked surprised. "You'd teach me?" "I would. I'm 63 years old, and my hands aren't as steady as they used to be. This territory's growing, and there's more work than one doctor can handle." Doc smiled. "Besides, you already know more than most people I've met. Might as well make it official." The lessons began the following week. Proper suturing with silk thread and curved needles. The art of setting bones, the treatment of common frontier ailments. Eli proved to be an excellent student, his damaged hands surprisingly nimble, his patience seemingly infinite. "Healing isn't about fixing what's broken," Doc told him one afternoon, as Eli practiced his stitches on a piece of leather. "It's about staying until what's broken remembers how to be whole." Eli paused, looking up at Doc with something like wonder. "That's beautiful," he said. "It's true, and it's what you did for Clara. You stayed until she remembered how to be whole again." Doc set down the supplies he had been organizing. "That's the real medicine, Eli. Not the stitches or the bandages or the salves. The staying, the patience, the willingness to be present when everything in you wants to run." Eli nodded slowly, his eyes moving toward the window where Clara was visible in the garden. Her hands, those hands that had nearly been lost, moving confidently among the tomato plants. "I used to think I ran because I was afraid of staying," he said quietly. "But now I think I was just looking for someone who made staying feel like home." "And Clara?" "Clara makes staying feel like home." Doc Patterson rode past the Brennan property on a warm afternoon 4 months after he had first seen a stranger with damaged hands carrying chickens into a root cellar. The transformation was remarkable. The new cabin stood solid and proud, smoke rising from its chimney, windows reflecting the late summer light. The garden stretched behind it, lush with vegetables, bordered by a fence that Eli had built with his own hands. 12 chickens pecked in the yard, and 2 dairy cows grazed in the pasture beyond. But what made Doc stop his horse was the sight on the front porch. Ellie and Clara sat together in the afternoon sun, their chairs close enough that their shoulders touched. Clara's hand rested in Eli's, the hand she couldn't feel 8 weeks ago, the hand that had been black with cold, the hand that was now warm and whole and interlaced with his. She waved to Doc with her free hand, the hand the cold had tried to take, and her smile was bright enough to light the whole territory. Doc thought about all the wounds he had treated in 32 years of frontier medicine. The physical wounds that healed clean, the physical wounds that left scars, the emotional wounds that never fully closed. And he thought about what he had witnessed over the past 4 months, 2 broken people who had somehow found in each other the healing they couldn't find alone. Some people leave when staying gets hard. Others stay until hard becomes home. Ellie Harding had stayed, and in staying, he had given Clara Brennan something more valuable than saved fingers or a rebuilt homestead. He had given her hope, the hope that not everyone leaves, that some people stay even when staying costs everything. As Doc rode away, he looked back one more time at the cabin, at the couple on the porch, at the life they were building together. And he saw, or perhaps he only imagined he saw, Clara's hand move to rest briefly on her stomach, a small curve barely visible beneath her dress. New life, new hope, new proof that staying is a choice that becomes a promise. Doc smiled and urged his horse forward, leaving them to their happiness, carrying with him the lesson he would never forget. Healing isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about staying until what's broken remembers how to be whole. The winter came early that year, not with the devastating fury of the blizzard that had brought Eli and Clara together, but with the gentle persistence of snow that fell steadily for days and covered everything in white. Clara stood at the window of their cabin, watching the snowflakes drift down, her hand resting on the swell of her belly where new life was growing. "Are you afraid?" Eli asked, coming to stand beside her. "Of the snow? Of everything? The baby? The winter? He hesitated. The possibility that things could go wrong. Clara turned to face him, and in the lamplight, her face was beautiful, not with the beauty of youth, but with the beauty of someone who had survived loss and found hope again. "I spent 26 months being afraid," she said softly. "Afraid that I brought bad luck to anyone who stayed close. Afraid that I would die alone like my husband, like my parents, like everyone I ever loved." She took his hand, the hand that had saved her, the hand that now wore a simple gold band on the fourth finger. "But you stayed, even when I pushed you away. Even when the whole town thought you were using me. Even when leaving would have been easier than staying." She lifted his hand to her lips, pressed a kiss to his knuckles. "So no, I'm not afraid anymore, because I finally know, that some people stay." Ellie pulled her close, careful of her belly, and they stood together at the window, watching the snow fall on their land, on their future, on the life they were building together. "I learned something from Doc Patterson," Eli said quietly. "He said healing isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about staying until what's broken remembers how to be whole." Clara leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Is that what you did for me?" "That's what we did for each other." He kissed the top of her head. "You reminded me that staying isn't the same as running in place. And I reminded you that some people, the right people, don't leave just because leaving is easy." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the scars of last winter's devastation, transforming the landscape into something new and clean and full of promise. And inside the cabin, by the warm glow of the lamp, a man who had learned too late what it meant to stay, and a woman who had learned too late what it meant to let someone stay, held each other close and waited for the spring to come. Because spring would come. It always did. And when it came, there would be new life, a child born to parents who understood, in the deepest part of their souls, that staying is a choice that becomes a promise. And that promises, the real ones, don't break. The end.